We'll have some questions. So Islam, violence and terrorism, they're basically three things that you associate together. You never think twice about that. And the reason we're giving tonight's talk is basically to explain to you explain to you Islam's stance on violence. So tonight's talker is Mr. Tim Winter. He's currently the Shaykh lecturer at the Faculty of Divinity. He's written and translated a number of books, including Bombing Without Moonlight, which is on this issue as well. So I'd like to hand over today's lecture.
Thank you very much. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think that because we have this video camera, I'm not supposed to stand up or pace around as I usually do, so I do hope people at the back can hear. Now, we're a sort of urbane and educated community here in Cambridge, so I don't propose to spend a long time dismissing a kind of BNP stereotype of Muslims being... Yeah, I don't propose to address or seek to seriously entertain the sort of wilder tabloid stereotype of Islam as being ineluctably inclined towards violence or intolerance. You will find that opinion on the right wing of the political spectrum across Europe and in the United States, but I suspect that it's not strongly represented in Cambridge. Just to remind you of what the facts actually are, in fact, statistically around the world, Muslims are amongst the least likely of communities to engage in acts of violence against civilians and in terrorist acts. I just been looking at some FBI statistics. According to the official FBI records, only 6% of terrorist attacks on US soil from 1980 to 2005 were carried out by Islamic extremists. The remaining 94% were from other groups, including violent groups that generally, because of certain media conventions, I guess, it might be interesting to speculate on exactly why these things get filtered out. Puerto Rican separatist terrorists are far more likely to commit such offences on US soil than are Muslims. There's still, believe it or not, communists who are engaged in these things. 5% such actions in the US in that period were from communist groups of various kinds. And here in Europe, even though just about every EU state seems to be paranoid about the potential or actual radicalisation of its Muslim minorities, the fact seems to be, and a recent Brookings Institute report on Islam in France seemed to confirm this, I think in a particularly scholarly and level-headed way, that it just isn't like that at all. So if you look at the website of Europol, you can look at the reports across different Europol member states for several years, 2007, 2008, 2009, are accessible online. And what you find is that 99.6% of attacks classified by police as terrorist in Europe at that time were by non-Muslim groups. 84.8% of attacks were from separatist groups with nothing to do with Islam, Corsican nationalists, Basque nationalists and other groups. Leftist groups account for more than 16 times as much terrorism as radical Islamic groups. Only 0.4% of terrorist attacks from 2007 to 2009 were attributed by European police forces to extremist Muslims. So you can take a look at the Europol website and see that for yourself. And generally, I think this is something that is common knowledge, that there is a certain paranoia about the Muslim threat alleged in Europe, which enables the media to focus in an often very disproportionate way on events associated with Muslims and generally filter out the other types of non-religious and non-Islamic terrorism. Another thing that is worth bearing in mind is the historical record. The current situation seems to be that Muslims have been, compared to some other groups, good as gold in the US and Europe. If we broaden the historic parameters a little bit and look at the big picture, it's worthwhile checking out something called the Body Count Project, which is based in the University of Kiel, where they engage in the possibly not wholly sophisticated policy of totting up all of the estimated casualties for major conflicts attributed to particular civilizational and religious communities down the centuries. And in the league table that they've currently come up with, they find that the religious community that has historically been least likely to bring about the death of civilians has actually been Hinduism. India historically is largely inert and doesn't invade its neighbours, a static society that for that reason is at the top of this league table. And Islam actually is number 2. And in the breakdown you can see that there's a few events in history which have put Muslims in the second rather than the first place. One of those events, by far the most violent eruption in Muslim history, was Timur, Tamerlane the Great, and his bloody invasions of Central Asia and India, the piles of skulls that he made in Samarkand and Delhi. And Muslims will object, saying Timur was only very superficially Islamized and it's got nothing to do with Islam. But that's not the point of the body count project. They're not assessing the religiosity of the culprits of these various events. They're just documenting the formal affiliation of the perpetrators to particular religious groups. And the other major event, breakdown in civility in Islamic history, turns out to be the Armenian massacres at the beginning of the 20th century, which, despite the continued denial of the Turkish establishment, was something that took place. And again, one could say it's got nothing to do with Islam, Muslims as such. It was Turkish nationalism. The Armenians were more or less fine under the Ottoman Empire when it was properly Islamic. But still, the purpose of this project is, again, to attribute events to the nominal religious adherence of the perpetrators, and so the statistics go up. So that's another very useful way, I think, although obviously statistics, a blunt instrument, often deceptive. At least it gives us some kind of sense of the fact that Islam has been comparatively pretty peaceable in its history when compared to certain other religious communities. Certainly much more peaceable than medieval Europe or medieval China, for instance, where the body count turns out to be much higher. So that essentially is the kind of preface I wanted to just remind you and remind us all of the actual facts behind the media hype. And if we go back in time, you often find that the stereotype of Islam is not the bloody scimitar, but actually oriental repose. Hegel in particular associated Islam as a principle of kind of inertia. It's the pasha sitting around smoking his hubbly-bubbly pipe, enjoying his Turkish delight and his slave girls, and sort of violence is just not part of that picture. Islam as fatalistic, as pleasure-loving, as indolent. 100 years ago, that was a much more likely stereotype to encounter than the current image. So let me, instead of trying to knock stereotypes redundantly on the head, try and do something more positive, and not to say what Islam isn't, but try and map out the admittedly complex story of the religion's relationship to violence, and also to what nowadays we call terrorism. What is exactly the status of religiously motivated war, holy war, quote unquote, and what exactly is Islamic law's categorization of attacks on civilians of the type that we would nowadays label with this rather vague but still presumably generally helpful category of terrorism. There is a certain point of view which possibly is gaining in saliency, particularly in Europe, which has a very strong anti-religious and atheistic activist movement at the moment, that wants to see monotheism as such as being inherently conflictual. I know people like Jean Assmann, who have said that the moment that Moses and the Israelites left Egypt and headed for the promised land, which they conquered with fire and sword, was the moment when the older, more convivial, on that view, relationship between the religions, which had been common in polytheistic societies, broke down. Because when Herodotus, for instance, visits Egypt 4 centuries or so before Christ, he finds the people worshipping Horus and Ammon, and is not shocked at all. He just says, well, this is presumably Zeus and Apollo, they just go by different names. Polytheism, on this view, is inherently more accommodating, more tolerant. Monotheism,